make sure I offer a few comments here at the beginning. I'm Lionel Jensen of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and if I can speak on behalf of my department and as well the Liu Institute for Asian Studies and also the Keough School of Global Affairs, I'll be so bold as to try to do that. I want to welcome all of you, including those guests who are with us this weekend to the third International Forum on Linguistics and Chinese Education. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce my colleague and friend Perry Link, Professor Emeritus of East Asian Studies at Princeton University, which has now been a little while ago, and Chancellorial Chair of Teaching across the discipline at the University of California, Riverside. Perry Link, who is also known as laureate. I think that's what he's published under, and since he often refers to this in his book, really remarkable book from a couple of years ago called Anatomy of Chinese, which I strongly recommend that you should all get a look at. If you haven't bought it, you should. In this, he makes very clear that he, in a sense, has a kind of double interiority. He is in China in a way, and he's also in the United States. He's a person who thinks and reasons and speaks in Chinese, but also in English. And the story of how he does these things simultaneously, if not every sort of sequence, is a very good thing for us to learn. It's also very amusing to have him talk about this, his learning of Chinese and what kind of world it's made richer for him. It is, in fact, important to note that he's no stranger to Notre Dame. Often when I'm introducing people here, it seems that I'm introducing them and welcome to Notre Dame for the first time or something. Perry's been there before, about 14 years ago. He was actually here to give a review of our Chinese language program. And of course, as in that visit, he is here again today to talk about Chinese language learning. And as part of a conference, as we all know, it's being carried on this weekend, this international forum which I just mentioned. He's written and co-edited a considerable number of books, The Use of Literature and Life in Socialist China, and Use of Literary Systems. I can read on these. I'm going to read on several of these. He's published and edited, written, and published so many works, it's often difficult for me to even keep track of them all. So I'm not going to go through a standard reading. So I'll read a few of the ones that are most important for me, and then I'm going to basically offer a few comments about Perry and Liu Xiaobo. Okay, so a few of the other books I'd like to emphasize. Evening Chats in Beijing, Probing China's Predicament. This is a book that Susan Bloom and I took with us secretly to, I guess it was kind of secretly, to Kunming in 1994. We were teaching a group of students, about 11 students, in Kunming, a sort of 8-week course of learning about Chinese language. Actually, they were learning Chinese language at the same time, also learning a great deal about contemporary life in China. So we did bring this pirated book, pirated by us, to Kunming and actually have students read it. I think we were often concerned, but we never told students that they had been a banned book because of Perry's being an agent of the CIA, which I think they were saying in those days. I think that was playing back then. Wasn't it? I think from like somewhere like 94, 95, you were becoming a CIA agent because of your relationship with Leo Binyan and Prodigiously and others. Okay, so another book I'd like to emphasize is the work that he and Andy Nathan were given the prospect of doing by way of secreting their possession of something they called the Tiananmen Papers, which laid out the conversations and reflections of members of the highest members of the Chinese Communist Party pertaining to the subduing of the events in Tiananmen, which in fact began with a comment made by Deng Xiaoping in April 23rd, 1989, when he announced, in fact, he did not fear shedding blood in the square, and that there should, in fact, be a move to clear it. We learned this from Perry and Andy's translation and commentary. But I want to stress something people really don't know about, which is he's an astonishingly masterful practitioner of the early modern satirical comic tradition of xiangxiang. It's an avocation made in no small part from his, I guess, his following of Y.R. Zhao, his pedagogical commitment to internalization of Chinese, which by way of humor is a very good way of doing that. I want to quote from Perry himself, because I think it signifies his love of literature, language, life, and a love that runs as a thread throughout his entire endeavor. Since he's here for pedagogy this weekend, and given the fact that so much of what Perry has done in recent years has been to be associated with his work as an advocate for human rights in China, and a very, I think, well-spoken and very powerful and stinting critic of the Chinese government for its lack of human rights. You might want to know what the link is, but I think that we should see what the link is now by way of this comment from Perry, and I think we should be very grateful to Perry, as I think the Chinese people are, for the link that he's made between language and human suffering and human struggle on behalf of freedom. Quote, I feel that my human rights work also depends importantly on Chinese language. For me, the reason why Chinese language is important in human rights work is that when I think about rights issues, I try to set aside what governments say and focus on the concerns that ordinary people have in daily life: food, housing, schooling, health, personal dignity, elemental fairness, and the power to control one's own life, and so on. Alongside this, I would like to bring in, you might say, conversation, a comment that comes from Charter 08, in fact, the opening to Charter 08, a work that in part brought the imprisonment of Liu Xiaobo, even though Liu himself was one of 8 people who proposed it and was not involved in writing, certainly in any measure, all of it. But I believe this might be associated with him. And I guess I told you that, or noted that Perry has actually translated this and appeared in the New York Times. It's also available online, and you can get a full sense of the patriotism of this particular word. The love for Chinese language and the love for China, I believe, is something which the poet Liu Xiaobo in large part makes clear here in the preface to Charter 8. Together we can work for major changes in Chinese society and for the rapid establishment of a free, democratic, and constitutional country. We can bring to reality the goals and ideals that our people have incessantly been seeking for more than 100 years, and can bring about a new chapter, a brilliant new chapter to Chinese civilization. I would invite you, maybe I would say urge you, to view Perry's testimony for the U.S. House Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights in International Organizations that was offered on July 14th, the day after Liu Xiaobo died. But I'd like to note here that the U.S. House Subcommittee was actually sort of convening this hearing on what I call the historic significance of Liu Xiaobo. And I believe if you want, even though there's technical difficulties with the microphones that occur in this event, it's important that you might have a look at it. It's not but a few minutes long, but I believe you'll be able to see Perry and the passion that makes him the rather amazing force that he is in our contemporary world. Someone who in many ways will modestly say that all he has done is translate Liu Xiaobo or been his friend, but more importantly it should be that Perry has done something which, for the most part, students in Tiananmen asked for in 1989, because we should not forget, never forget what happened here. And Perry's unstinting commitment to speaking on behalf of justice and fairness and righteousness is at the root of this possibility that Liu Xiaobo also dearly hoped for. You can also see a print version of this online if you'd like. From this appearance alone, one can learn a great deal about Perry, in particular his passion for justice, and it is a certain poetry of this justice that binds his voice to Liu's in a loud declaration of righteousness. And here I'm, I guess, phrasing here a very famous passage from the monks or the Mencius. They're able to offer a voice of righteousness that in Liu's case is greater than life itself. Please join me in recognition of Perry Link. He'll be speaking up on the life ideas of Liu Xiaobo.
My old friend Lionel has given an overly rosy introduction of me. Just trying to understand the world as the rest of you are. And I'm very happy to be in Notre Dame again and see so many people come out, even though there's no football game or tennis. But when I saw the food, I understood your real reason. I'll try to give you some intellectual food to go with the more interesting kind that we all have. This book that Lionel briefly referred to is a collection of essays and poems by Liu Xiaobo from his mature years, by which I mean 1999 to 2008. It was a few years ago in the fall, right after the announcement that he would get the Nobel Prize, that Harvard University Press called me up and said, we have a submission of his essays and poems, and we'd like you to be an outside reader for it. It wasn't translated yet, it was in Chinese, and I said, okay, I'll do that. And they sent me the text, but before it even got to me, they called again and said, never mind reading it for us, we've decided to publish it. Now, will you be the editor? And I thought hard about it for about 15 minutes and said, yes. It's really good. I recommend that you, Liu Xiaobo, No Enemies, No Hatred, published in 2012, because it really gives you, better than I'll be able to give you today, an insight into his thinking. I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of the introduction to the book that I wrote. Liu Xiaobo is one of those unusual people who can look at human life from the broadest of perspectives and reason about it from first principles. His keen intellect notices things that others also look at but do not see. It seems that hardly any topic in Chinese culture, politics, or society evades his interest, and he can write with analytic calm about upsetting things. One might expect such calm in a recluse, a hermit poet, or a cloistered scholar, but in Liu Xiaobo it comes in an activist. Repeatedly, he has gone where he thinks he should go and done what he thinks he should do, as if immune to things like havoc, danger, and the possibility of prison. He seems to move through life taking mental notes on what he sees, hears, and reads, as well as on the inward responses that he feels. Luckily for us, his readers, he also has a habit of writing free from fear. Most Chinese writers today, including many of the best ones, write with political caution in the backs of their minds and with a shadow hovering over their fingers as they pass across the keyboard. How should I couch things? What topics should I not touch? What indirection should I use? Liu Xiaobo does none of this. With him, it's all there. What he thinks, you get. Now, I clearly admire him, as you can see there, and especially admire the essays he wrote in that decade that is contained in this book. But his life was not a smooth ride from cradle to the end in heroism. It had significant ups and downs, and two periods of what I'd call immature egoism, followed by two repentances from that, with the help of two remarkable women, by the way, who were his first and second wives. And in perspective, I think his ability to be self-critical was really what made him into the wonderful thinker that he was by the end. I'll sketch briefly where these ups and downs brought him. He was born in 1955 in the city of Changchun in northeast China. Third of 5 children, all boys. He was called the Xiaosan, the little number 3. In an intellectual family, his father was a professor of linguistics and his mother a professor of children's literature. He, Xiaosan, was very, very bright and independent-minded from the beginning. He got into trouble in primary school for criticizing his teacher for being too simple-minded. He had severe conflicts with his father. He probably, in our standards, would count as having been an abused child. His father used to beat him with a belt. On the other hand, he had very close relations with his aunt, the sister of his father, and she was his sort of pillow from which to recover from his father. From 1966 to 69, the first years, the most dramatic years of China's Mr. Mao's great cultural revolution, he was in and out of schools. the schools closed and then they reopened, but they reopened in order to null him in, make revolution. So he didn't really get very good education in those years. And meanwhile, watched the Red Guards in their dramatic and sometimes violent activities up and down the main street of Changchun, which was called Stalin Avenue at the time. He was only 11 to 14 years old then, so he didn't really participate, but he watched the fanaticism and violence and did get caught up a bit, and later wrote essays regretting what he had done. This is his remarkable self-correcting ability. In those same years, he took up smoking at age 11, partly because his father forbade him to smoke, and yet he did. And he wrote an essay later explaining why his smoking involved him in two more serious moral violations, one of which was lying, because he lied about the fact he was smoking, and the other was stealing, because he had to swipe money from his father's wallet in order to buy the cigarettes. Maybe you can see why his father was angry at him. In 1969, the whole family was sent to a village in Inner Mongolia, where his father had been sent down to learn from the people, even though his father was very politically correct up until then, a party member and so on. And in the countryside, in this small village, he discovered reading. There were two big influences in his life that came in those years. One was reading, because he had no school to go to, so he started reading. He read Liu Xiaobo, the great modern Chinese writer, and he read the entire works of Karl Marx. Now, you might think that would indoctrinate him in a communist ideology, but it didn't really. The original works of Marx have a lot to do with intellectual history of Europe, and he learned about all kinds of thinkers by doing that. But it generated in him a kind of uneasiness, because he loved this world of reading, and it became a lifetime habit. He ended up an extremely broad reader and erudite commentator, and if you don't believe me, read his essays here. It's amazing how broad they are. But he felt uneasy because he had this wonderful world of the imagination into which to dive through reading. But outside, it wasn't violent out in Inner Mongolia, but it was regimented and poverty-stricken, and regimented is the key thing. The being politically correct was so stifling outside the home, and inside the home he was reading all of these things. The other big influence that he got during those years was from Tao Li, his girlfriend and later his first wife. She had grown up in Changchun in the same courtyard. Her parents were also professors, and so they knew each other from when they were running around as childhood playmates. That family was sent to the same village out in Mongolia, and she too became addicted to reading during those years. So in all of those ways, their lives were parallel, but in one important way, they were very different because their characters were so different. She was tall and quiet and demure and steady and avoided the limelight. He was the opposite of all of those things, really. In 1969, they came back to Changchun, and 1978, 1969 is when they went. And he went to college at the Chinese department of Jilin Daxue, Jilin University. And those years were heady years for young Chinese intellectuals because they were the so-called star literature period, when Liu Bingyan and Wang Meng and Bai Hua and all of these writers were telling truths about what had happened in the late Mao years that until then hadn't been tellable. And it gave to young people the sense that, the shackles are off. Now we can do all of these things we couldn't do before in political ways, social ways, intellectual, religious, all these areas were opening up. But then they were disappointed as all of this budding expansion was knocked down by political campaigns the Strike Hard campaign, 严打, and then 反资产阶级自由化, anti-bourgeois liberalism, and 铲除精神污染, all in the early 80s. And it gave them the impression that these avenues that had been open to them were closing, except, and this affected Liu Xiaobo's life significantly, except the aesthetic realm. That was the one area where one could still be one's own person and explore. So he turned to aesthetics. In 1982, when he graduated from Jilin University, he went to Beijing Normal University for an MA, and he did his MA paper on zhuangzi, admiring the idiosyncratic, mind-expanding, leaping zhuangzi in this mode of aesthetic freedom. In 1982, he also married his girlfriend, Tao Li, and they had a son. They couldn't marry before then because in those days in China, it was illegal to 谈恋爱 on a university campus to be boyfriend and girlfriend. So they waited and they married as soon as they graduated. In 1986, he finished his MA. In fact, he finished in 84, but in 1986 began a PhD program in which aesthetics was still his main interest. He wrote a dissertation called Aesthetics and Human Freedom. But as I said, he had this kind of flamboyant stage as a teenager, and then with this aesthetics and human freedom, his flamboyant side came out again. There was a conference in 1986 on Chinese literature in the new era, where all of the prominent post-Mao writers were, and it was supposed to be a celebration of how well we're doing. Well, he stood up and said, we're not doing well. There are all of these mind shackles that we're still within. And he went through all of the famous writers and told them one by one, or told everybody one by one, why Wang Mang was too afraid to really confront the party's ways, how the roots writers, the Shingun writers, were going in the wrong direction. They're looking back to China's roots as the way out of these things where we should be looking forward. There's problems with Chinese roots. And so those writers too, by name, he denounced even Liu Binian, the famous investigative journalist whom you'd think would be a hero of his, though was denounced because he was too willing to put hope in a hero, in someone like Hu Yaobang, or someone who would come along and set things right for China. And Liu Xiaobo found this naive in a sense. He wrote this: I can sum up what's wrong with Chinese writers in one sentence. They can't write creatively themselves. They simply don't have the ability because their very lives don't belong to them. Well, this outburst gave him a reputation as being a heila, the black horse on the literary scene. Later, he regretted it, by the way. Another that he attacked was the famous literary critic Liu Xiaobo. And later, after Liu Xiaobo had moved to Colorado, Liu Xiaobo apologized to him, said, I shouldn't have denounced you, but please understand it was the only way I could get famous. Liu Xiaobo confirms that story, by the way. In 1988, he finished a book called Chinese Politics and Chinese Intellectuals. The main theme of which was to say that all of these wonderful Western writers he discovered were the standard of how an intellectual should be, and China has to catch up with that standard. He was a lecturer at Beijing Normal University after his PhD, and that kind of theme made him a very popular lecturer. Students crowded just to audit his courses. Then in 1989, there were two big turning points in his life. One was that he traveled to Europe and the US and became disillusioned with things in the West, with certain things anyway. The West could no longer be that standard toward which Chinese progress would be measured. He went to the University of Oslo for a conference on modern Chinese film that he found, and I quote, agonizingly boring. The sinologists, the European sinologists, could not speak Chinese, which disappointed him, and were too willing to accept at face value the pronouncements of the Chinese government. He concluded, and I quote again, that 98% are useless. Next, he went to New York and was a visiting scholar at Columbia University, where he learned more about Western civilization and became more disillusioned with the West as a model because of problems like the energy crisis, environmental imbalance, nuclear disarmament, and what he called, and I quote again, the addiction to pleasure and to commercialization. And concluded that now I have to do two critiques simultaneously. One is to critique Chinese intellectuals as they live up to the standards of Western ones. And secondly, I have to criticize or critique the Western standards themselves and have only my own brain on which to start doing that. And he felt he was suddenly unclothed. He was like a child beginning again. Here again, you see his virtue of being able to be self-critical. He'd been a hugely popular lecturer at Beishida, and now is saying, I have to start all over again. He went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and was smitten by transcendent questions, you might say, and talked about the incompleteness of the individual person, and even found his former idol Wu Xun to be lacking there. Wu Xun is brilliant in this uncovering human problems of cruelty and lack of sympathy and social inequalities. But when it comes to transcendent questions like death, Wu Xun couldn't address these things. So that was one big turning point in his life. But in that same spring of '89, you all know the the broad democracy movement in China was building up, and he read about it in the newspapers in New York and decided to go straight from New York to Beijing to join, writing this. I hope I'm not the person who, I hope that I'm not the type of person who, standing at the doorway to hell, strikes an heroic pose and then starts frowning with indecision. So he flew to Beijing, went to the square, organized a hunger strike that a few of his friends and he led, and some students followed, and wrote a June 2nd hunger strike declaration, which I'll quote here from briefly. He says, "We must begin to build democracy in China in a spirit of tolerance and with conscious cooperation. A democratic society is not built on hatred and enmity." That's the first mention of what became his theme song. No enemies, no hatred. He thought that the way the Communist Party's rhetoric argues with people, trains people to think in hero versus enemy terms. And that the escape from that was to stop taking opponents as enemies. And continuing to read here. Not built on hatred and enmity, it is built on consultation, debate, and voting that are carried out on a basis of mutual respect, tolerance, and willingness to compromise. That willingness to compromise came into play just the very next day when the 27th Army of the PLA started to move towards the Tiananmen Square, and people on Chalan Boulevard and elsewhere were being mowed down and shot. And he and his friends in the square who wrote this declaration realized that if we don't get the students out of the square, there's going to be mayhem here. And they did. They negotiated with the military, and Liu Xiaobo took his role as leading the students out of the square, including a very dramatic place where he confiscated from them one of their machine guns that they captured somehow and smashed it and said, "We mustn't fight, we mustn't use guns." And they did leave. It's impossible to say how many lives he saved by doing that, but certainly hundreds, probably more than 1,000. His friend Zhou Duo, who was one of the other strikers with him in the middle of the square, estimates at least 1,000 lives saved. At his trial in December 2009, he starts his final statement with the sentence, June 1989 has been the major turning point in my life. Anyway, the massacre happened, and he was arrested 5 days later as a black hand behind what was then called the counter-revolutionary riot, and sent to Qingtong prison in Beijing, which is an elite prison. It's where Madame Mao was held when she was there, and it's not one of the tough, dirty, violent prisons that others have had to go through. He said again that he was basically bored while he was in prison, but did something that really worried him later, and is another turning point in his life, and that is that he wrote a confession. You know, the Chinese police like to do that, to ask you to confess and to help you. They'll write the statement for you and say all you have to do is sign. And I don't know the details. Nobody knows what that confession said because it hasn't been published. The only source we have on what the confession was are his own essays, where he writes about how he regrets having done that. And this led him to be even more deeply self-critical. When he got out of prison in 1991, he was therefore flat on his back, you might say, morally, emotionally, economically, because Beijing Normal University had fired him. You can't hire a black hand behind a counter-revolutionary riot. So he had no job. He also lost his wife, Tao Li. Here again is not the brightest area of his life, but in the late 80s, when he was with the students and so popular, he had some extramarital dalliances that she knew about, and she forgave him for it. When he went to the square in '89, she waited for him at the gate of Beijing Normal, and he didn't come back, and she didn't see him again. So she really put up with quite a lot. And while he was in prison, she brought him divorce papers, or his lawyer did, and he saw that she was right. He signed the papers, and that was that. His second wife, I mentioned at the beginning that these two women both had effects on him. The second wife is the poet and photographer Liu Xiaobo, whom he met in the 1980s when both of them were married to others, and they didn't have a romantic tie at first. They were just in this group of Beijing artists. But then after he came out, she divorced, and he, of course, had divorced, and they started living together in the early 1990s. And in 1996, they had a big banquet, a Chinese-style, now we're married kind of things, but didn't register with the government. Then in the fall of '96, he was put back into prison, this time in a labor camp near Dalian, presumably for an essay that he had written with, I'm trying to remember the other one, I can't right now, about Taiwan and cross-strait relations should be more Pacific, and we should recognize the claims of the other side. And he was sent to a labor camp. She, although they weren't formally married, were together, and she went up to the prison in order to bring him books, which he loved and still loved. And they wouldn't let her bring him books monthly unless they were married. So there in the labor camp, they signed forms and got officially married. And it still took a number of months for the bureaucracy to let her visit him and bring him books. But they did, and she was very loyal about that. 1 month for 3 years, every month she would go up from Beijing to Dalian to bring him books. Where am I in my notes here? Yeah. It was in those years, 96 to 99, that he began writing poems. And I honestly think, just from a literary point of view, he is a very good poet. A lot of his poems were to his wife, Liu Xiaobo, but they are very broad in their range. He has one about St. Augustine, one about Immanuel Kant, one about a murdered puppy that his mean father had killed in order to comply with the government regulations in the Cultural Revolution to get rid of dogs. So a huge variety. I'm going to read one of the poems. This he wrote while he was in that labor camp. He wrote a poem until he died, I'm sure, every anniversary of June 4th. And this was the 10th anniversary when he was in the labor camp. And it's a long poem. I'm going to read just the first section of about 8 sections. It's called 站在时间的诅咒中, standing in the execrations of time is how we translate it. To me, standing amid the execrations of time, that day seems so strange. 10 years ago this day, dawn, a bloody shirt, sun, a torn calendar, all eyes upon this single page. The world, a single outraged stare. Time tolerates no naivete. The dead rage and howl till the earth's throat grows hoarse. Gripping the bars, he's in prison then. This moment, I must wail in grief. For I fear the next so much I have no tears for it. Remembering them, the innocent dead, I must thrust a dagger calmly into my eyes, must purchase with blindness a clarity of the brain, for that bone-devouring memory is best expressed by refusal. When he got out of the labor camp, he began writing political essays for magazines in Hong Kong and the US. And that's what this book contains, those essays. And some of them got back to China because the internet was just humming up in those years, and they could come back that way. There are 24 of them in this book, and I won't have time to do everything I should do here. In fact, let me keep an eye on the time. But a couple of them are about the internet itself. He has one called Long Live the Internet, which he called God's gift to the Chinese people. The first news medium in the history of the People's Republic of China that couldn't be completely controlled. The first was radio, and then newspapers, and bulletin boards, and television, and one by one, the propaganda department can control those. But the internet, as our famous President Bill Clinton said, is like trying to nail jelly to a wall, and you can read all kinds of things about the cat and mouse games that even now netizens play in order to get around the controls. June 4th, for example, that super sensitive day can be referred to as May 31st, 35th, right? And June 4th. But he analyzes the benefit of this God's gift to the Chinese people in several ways. One is which it forced the official party-run media to do a better job. Because when people have their computers and later their smartphones and news gets passed around like that, nobody's going to read the People's Daily if you've got this other much more realistic source of news, right? Then the People's Daily level realizes that fact and is obliged to be more realistic themselves in order to have the attention of readers. So that news source became one of the big virtues of the internet. The other was that it was a platform for opinion that couldn't be expressed before. It was safer to be online, using a pseudonym, saying what you think, agreeing with others, just alone in front of your computer, not physically gathered. In those days, anytime there was a meeting that talked about political things, the police could come in and physically break up the meeting and send you home and maybe punish you. But if you're on your computers talking, there's what he calls cyber assembly. There's a way to become a group without being in a group, and the internet made this possible. He has another essay that he calls The Significance of the Weng'an Incident. Weng'an is a town in Guizhou where there was a famous case where a young woman was raped by 4 politically well-connected hooligans, and then her body was thrown into a river. And normally, of course, the state media would never touch something like that, but it got out on the internet. And a lot of people in the area knew about it. And 2 or 3 days later, there was a huge demonstration in front of the government buildings that happened because people knew about this incident. But then what Liu Xiaobo does, very wisely, I think, analyzes why thousands of people would come, because they didn't know this young woman. There was no personal connection. But there was a big attraction to coming. Why? Because they, in their individual context, had similar kinds of grievances against the people persecuting them. So this became a sort of a flagpole around which to gather. So for these reasons, he has a lot to say about the internet. One more about the internet I'll mention is called Imprisoning People for Their Words, which he starts out, again, by taking internet examples of local bullies picking on people in local areas, and in the local context, the internet spreads the word and embarrasses the bully into having to take back his words and sometimes even be moderately punished for it. And he lists these 6 or 8 cases at the beginning and shows us that these are local cases. They don't depend on the internet internationally. They don't need Human Rights Watch in New York to tell them what's right or wrong. And they're not about famous dissidents like me. They're local people using the internet in order to essentially show that it's wrong to imprison people for their words. He has an essay on humor. From wicked satire to ugao. The word ugao is impossible to translate. Making fun of, or poking fun at, or making a mess of something. But it's about political humor. And he raises the question of whether political jokes on the informal internet or the grapevine are a kind of a safety valve. Because some Chinese thinkers say that a joke will let you blow off steam at somebody or something, but then recover you back into normalcy so that you go to work and you're that way the next day just as normal. And in that sense, the political humor is counterproductive. It almost serves as just a safety valve. And he reviews those arguments, but then comes down on the other side of the argument, saying that no, jokes about corruption reach as far as corruption itself reaches into every cranny of society and prepares the ground for change in the long run. And here's an example of how erudite he is. He suddenly jumps into a comparison of Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia and Milan Kundera, whose first book, The Joke, was about humor in a Eastern European society. And he says, now which of these characters, Havel or Kundera, was most important in bringing about the post-totalitarian situation in Eastern Europe after 1989? And his answer is both. Havel stands up on his soapbox and preaches big principles and suffers for it, and then he's referring to his own kind of role here. Kundera doesn't, but spreads the notion of satire, of corruption, into the turf of Czechoslovakia, which then is useful when the change comes. I'll read you a paragraph from this essay. In China, political jokes have already been making it clear for some time now that the legitimacy of the dictatorship is unsustainable. This means that an end, when it comes, will not be so much of a shock. People will be able to take it more easily in stride, and this will have the benefit of reducing anxieties and lessening the likelihood that people will seek violent revenge. Here again, you see his theme of no hatred, no enemies. This is how to make things less violent. Because jokes had been letting them blow off steam, some of their anger, because jokes had been letting them blow off some of their anger all along, they will have less accumulated anger to deal with. And in addition to that, the positive values that have underlain practical jokes will be available for use after the transition. In a post-totalitarian dictatorship, the grins of the people are the nightmares of the dictators. He has a remarkable essay, the longest in the book, called The Erotic Carnival in Recent Chinese History, where he surveys the rise of sex, or at least the prominent display of sex in Chinese public life from the 1980s to the present when he's writing the essay. From the time when, in the Mao era, with the model operas, the Yangbanxi romance just amounted to a subtle glance between the male and female protagonists on stage, all the way to the 1990s and the 2000s, where he gives an example of a banquet where a nude female body is on the table alive, and the dishes are put right on her body for these guys to take their portions from. And then he analyzes what this erotic carnival is. Number one, it's a kind of corruption. Number two, it's a diversion from politics, because you can't talk about social ideals or religious ideals, but you get diverted into thought and talk about sex. And then third, and most interestingly, he sees it as misogyny in disguise. And he gives the example of a woman, famous woman broadcast figure called Zhao Wei, a reporter who inadvertently had showed up once at the television studio where a red sun appeared in her clothing and got shown online. And these young male observers saw that red sign as a pro-Japan sign, which I doubt was meant. Liu Xiaobo doesn't think it was meant, but then they start tweeting things like, "Let her move to Japan if she wants to be a whore. If Japanese can do her, why can't we?" And Liu Xiaobo analyzes that kind of reaction as a way that these oversexed young males can fantasize about violent sex with a spectacular female figure, all while calling it patriotism, right? So that the phrase male chauvinism comes out having two different levels of meaning. He has an essay called Behind the Rise of the Great Power, where he's aiming at us in the overseas world here, in part, on the much vaunted rise of China in the world. And I'll read you a paragraph from it. The Communist Party of China defend their dictatorial system any way they can. Around the world, a blood transfusion machine for a host of other smaller dictatorships. When the rise, so-called, of a large dictatorial state that commands rapidly increasing economic strength meets with no effective deterrence from the outside, but only an attitude of appeasement from the international mainstream. And if the communists succeed in once again leading China down a disastrously mistaken historical road, here he's comparing it with the Cultural Revolution disastrous road, or the Great Deep Famine disastrous road. Continuing here, the results will not only be another catastrophe for the Chinese people, but likely also a disaster for the spread of liberal democracy in the world. I'm running short on time, so I'll go quickly over a few others. He has an essay on Tibet called So Long as Chinese Have No Freedom, Tibet Will Have No Autonomy, where he says the essential problem with Tibet is not ethnic. It's that you have a authoritarian government that is splitting people, whether or not they are of different ethnicities. He talks about the Dalai Lama being exiled, and Li Hongzhi, the leader of the Falun Gong. He's not a fan of Falun Gong, but he shows that the control of people really subsumes the question of ethnic differences, and these people with different ethnic differences suffer the same pattern. He has an essay that he wrote the day after Barack Obama was elected called Obama's Election and a Proposal for China. I was very impressed with this essay, partly because it showed what a detailed knowledge he had of US history. He said, you have the Democratic Party, which is sort of supposed to be closer in general to the Black community, but if you go back in history, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and he marches us all through the last 150 years of US history, showing how both the Republicans and the Democrats had that kind of contribution. George W. Bush had his Secretary of State and so on, Black people. And so he admires that in the United States democracy. And he ends the essay with this word, or near the end anyway: if the Chinese leaders were really wise, they could invite the Dalai Lama back to China to serve as our nation's president. Our Barack Obama. Such a move would make best use of the Dalai Lama's stature in Tibet and around the world. Now, don't misunderstand. He's smart enough to know that that is way out west of Pluto in terms of its feasibility. He doesn't think that. But the underlying point he's making, the Dalai Lama's prestige, if it were garnered by China and the Chinese people, would be immensely useful, and it would not make the whole country come crashing down to have that kind of a leader. He has an essay called the gold medal syndrome about the Olympic Games. The Olympics, of course, were held in Beijing in 2008, right here when he wrote this essay, bemoaning the fact that ordinary people in ordinary schools all around China hardly have playgrounds and seesaws, and yet this immense amount of money and training is put into trying to get gold medals, and silver doesn't work. China's got to have the most gold medals. And then he looks at the consequences for the Olympic athletes themselves, talking about a woman sprinter who was not even told that her mother died because they didn't want to disturb her 6 months before she was going to perform in the Olympics. And another child who was on the diving training team and was suffering retinal damage in the eye, because that's what happens when you jump into the water from heights as a child. And that these things were known about, but secondary to the mission of getting gold medals. He has a brilliant essay on Confucius, arguing that Confucius, compared with China's other ancient thinkers like Zhuangzi, who's his favorite, but mentions Han Fei, Zhu and others, and he's pretty erudite in talking about all of these thinkers. Confucius showed a mediocre intellect and only meager talent for human empathy. He quotes the famous Confucian-esque slogan, 见则兼济天下，退则独善其身. You step forward to help things in the world, but then when things go bad, you withdraw and become a hermit. What do you mean withdraw and be a hermit, says Liu Xiaobo? When things are bad outside, is exactly when you should stand up and try to do something about it. And has this in the essay, these sentences: how costly has it been for the Chinese people that this particular thinker, this most sly, most smooth, most utilitarian, most worldly wise Confucius, who shied away from public responsibility and showed no empathy for people who suffer, became their sage and exemplar for 2,000 years. If that sounds harsh, read the whole essay. It's not quite that harsh, but that's the point. He has a brilliant article on the 20th century writer Ba Jin in his later years, who lived to be more than 100 years old and was lying in a hospital on life support machines, even then being paraded by the government as a symbol of our great writer, and Ba Jin supports us and so on. I'll tell you one more. Am I running too long here? I am.
Yeah, you can read one more.
It's 1 o'clock, yeah. Well, I haven't told you about the whole Charter 08 that he was responsible for. Let me do that and then stop. Well before 08, 05, 06, some of his friends, Chinese intellectuals, or so-called dissident types in Beijing, were talking about doing this kind of a democracy manifesto as a blueprint for what we hope our country could be, and started writing drafts of it. And it got geared up in 2008 because they wanted it to coincide with the 08 Universal Declaration of Human Rights anniversary. He didn't join at first, partly I think because he didn't think it would work. But then when he saw the momentum gathering and saw that it would work, he played two very crucial roles. One was to spread it. His ideal, again, no enemies, no hatred. This shouldn't be an angry group of intellectuals doing this. We should make it broad. So he went to leaders in the labor movement and among farmers and government officials who agreed with the ideas and tried to get various kinds of people to sign it, and succeeded pretty well with that. The other thing he did was to, quote unquote, take responsibility for it, because everybody knew that the tactic of the government when this kind of movement, this challenge comes up, is to identify the leader and pick off the leader. Right? Shoot the head off the one that dares to stick his head up. He volunteered to be one. I'll stick my head up. I'll put my name on it. And indeed, he was then blamed and imprisoned for doing the charter. I won't review the charter for you. It's not a literary masterpiece. It's a hodgepodge of drafts that was thrown together fairly quickly. They sent it to me in October by email to Riverside and said, will you translate this? And I left it in my computer memory and didn't even read it for a while. I didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't know about its history. And then they wrote and said, if you won't translate it, we're going to give it to somebody else. And when I read it, oh, good. This is important, I'll translate it. It wasn't a literary masterpiece, but I did my best translating it. And then, as the time to announce it, December 10th, 2008, drew near, he called me up a number of times and said, change this, change that. Take out the references to the Tiananmen massacre. Take out the references to the Falun Gong and add these words and stuff. And I did for a while, but then I said I wouldn't as it became close to the end. And my reason for saying no was that 300 people had already signed it. And yet one person, this very peppery Liu Xiaobo, was calling up saying, do this and doing that, changing. So I didn't. I think he was a little irritated with me at that point. But if you take my translation, which the New York Review of Books published, and compare it with the one that was announced on December 8th, there are differences, certain things. And that's not because I am a bad translator. It's independent of the fact that I'm a bad translator. It's because we had those differences close to the end. They did release it on December 8th, not 10th. And that's because word of it leaked out. And they were afraid that the government would prevent its announcement at all. So they said, get it out there and then we'll deal with the aftermath. And that's what they did. And there was an aftermath. The people that had been involved in it were all invited to come hush high. He was the only one who was sent to prison for it. And there's no question that the reason for his 11-year imprisonment was 8-year imprisonment. The sentence was 11 years. You all know he died last July in police custody. I was going to say, there's no doubt about the causal chain between Charter 08 and his imprisonment to his Nobel Prize. Liu Xia, his wife, set out a list of people to invite to the Nobel ceremony, and I was on the list, so I was there at the banquet. I was sitting next to a woman who was on the Nobel selection committee. And I asked the obvious question, how'd you come to give it to this man? And she said that they had been thinking for a long time that it would be good to give to a Chinese person. And this year, it just seemed like the right time. That's as far as she went, but I infer from that that it was the imprisonment. Well, it just happened. And this one figure, so that's a good person to focus it on. And I'll stop here, though, and welcome your questions, comments.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is time for questions. Questions rather than suggest comments. Comments sometimes get a little efflorescent and powerful in a way that's irrelevant to the topic.
I don't mind powerful comments as long as they're not long. I agree with our host.
As long as they're based upon some basic understanding
Make a big
of the
speech.
real world.
Yeah. There are two of you here. Okay, the next, the one behind me. Go ahead. No, elderly first.
Thank you very much. My question is, how serious is the Chinese government's application of the National Human Rights Action Plan, September last year? The Chinese government outlines a whole policy about not only economic, social, and cultural rights, but also civil and political rights.
All right. How serious is it?
Yeah, is it is it just a piece of paper, or does it have a domestically political consequences?
It's serious in that it has a serious aim, which is to diffuse criticism of the Chinese government for not doing these things. The Chinese government has always been very sensitive about the topic of human rights. And the charges, mostly from the Western world, that they fall short by it. So do what they can in order to blunt it. And one way to blunt it is to say that we have a different definition of human rights, and it includes things you people are overlooking, and we're doing quite well in that way. Another way is to draw mostly from American media about problems in our society and elsewhere in the West, and to argue that you have human rights problems too, so why don't you attend to your own business? And in that sense, they're very serious about that effort. But if I understand your question, you're asking, is it a serious attempt to ameliorate conditions inside China and do better with human rights inside China? No, I don't think so. And that's not new news. That from the beginning, that's been the case. A number of Western governments have made arrangements with the Chinese government to have dialogues on human rights. And I've talked to people who've been in these dialogues, and they just talk past each other. One side says, you have these human rights problems, and the other says, we don't have these human rights problems, and you do, and then that's that. I actually think those dialogues do more harm than good, because when it's announced that we're having human rights dialogues, and people like you and me might think, oh, well, they're making progress, at least that's happening. But they're not. My view. In the back, yeah.
Yes. Following up to that question, a really quick one. Do you see private sector product-driven interests as a potential way for the government potentially to attend more to human rights in terms of corporate social responsibility? That's
Private-driven,
like kind of profit-driven.
Profit-driven
interests
would make human rights.
Make China as a government more serious about actually implementing on human rights.
Could you spell out how that would work? What do you mean?
For example, like all these kind of foreign investments, the things they're trying to do with One Belt One Road, they're actually like, at least based on my very limited understanding, that they're trying really hard to kind of get better at adjusting to the local business. For example, in South Africa, just to make sure that human rights are not violated so that their business can get running. So it's kind of profit economic driven, but do you see a potential even there that?
I haven't studied that question carefully about how One Belt, One Road and other investment projects around the world are received. But what I read in the New York Times and elsewhere is that the Chinese government doesn't do very well with human rights. I mean, the reason for going to Africa is to get copper and other resources. It almost resembles classic European imperialism a couple of centuries ago. And does the Chinese government go to an African country and say, we have to do better with human rights in order to have a good economic relation with you? No, I don't think so. Okay, all the questions here, right?
Mary, let's move your book away from the.
Yeah, let's take this.
Okay.
Take the microphone, please.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Good. Sorry.
It's reacting adversely to the.
Thank you, Professor Link, for your wonderful speech. I want to ask two questions. The first
You had a
one-
second question, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Do you want to go very quickly?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's also a question for a lot of the young Chinese intellectual or people who are interested in like, where do you see as a potential way for us in this era to progress and to somehow inherit this intellectual journey that we have as a one generation in that sense? Through arts.
That's a huge question. For one, doing what you're doing this morning, coming and hearing about this person, and if you read the book and talk with other people about the ideas in this book, tell the truth honestly as you go. He has another essay, which was one of the ones that put him in prison, called To Change a Regime by Changing a Society, where he begins by saying, we can't expect a hero to come out of the top leadership and change things for us. There's no one like Jiang Jingguo in Taiwan or Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia to look at, and we should not do that. We have to start from the bottom, where we are, or the middle, wherever it is, and be civil to each other. Regard the other person as a respectable human being and speak as if that's the truth, and push gently from below with that kind of no enemies, no hatred approach. Once in a while, we will be smitten down, so then we retreat, and then go back when the space opens up again, and slowly, changing a society will change the regime. That in very broad terms would be his answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my first question is very similar because he says that no enemy, no state.
Yeah.
But apparently to the regime, he is an enemy to the regime because
Right.
of his influence and his ideology.
Right.
So for people who wants to be vocal and self-critic, but also don't want to be antagonized by the regime, what is the best way of dealing with the kind of situation?
Okay, everybody hear that question? What's the best way for somebody who's inside the system and may share the ideals that he articulates, but doesn't want to run the risk of being an enemy and getting thrown in prison? That's a great question. And a number of examples among other friends of mine are examples of it. I have a bunch of friends. I can't go to China these days, I'm on the blacklist, but I can get on the internet and talk with them. And they're people that they say are teacher inside the system. But if you ask them, what do you think about this or that question, they agree entirely with each other. But they don't stick their neck out and get their head blown off. I respect that. He has an essay where he explains that that's perfectly respectable. A subtlety comes in though, because you can have a kind of a, should I use the word opportunistic approach to that? Where someone inside the system is being authoritarian or selfish or something like that, and wears this veneer of saying, oh, I'm really working inside the system, when actually they're not. That kind of example is there too. But is it possible to be an honest proponent of no enemies, no hatred, and a more democratic society inside the system? Yes, it's possible, and in many ways it's even more important than being a gadfly on the outside. Okay? Yeah. Second question. Okay.
Okay, so given the various topics, very deep thoughts covered by Liu Xiaobo in his essays,
Yeah.
do you perceive that he had an audience in mind when he was writing all these essays? And how influential you think the book is within China? Because probably not a lot of people are proactively trying to read his essays.
So who are his readers? Does he write with a certain readership in mind? And how big can the effect be given that his books are banned? On the first question, I don't think he does really have an audience in mind. He's always had that kind of arrogant idea that here's what I think and deal with it. Right from the beginning, when he got in trouble and was an arrogant person, that was his attitude. And even then when in New York and with the Metropolitan Museum, he suddenly realized how humble he is intellectually. Where he picked up and went on was still on the basis that here's what I honestly think, rather than what do you want me to say, who's the opposite of Hillary Clinton. But how effective can his works be given that they're banned is a good question. In the early 2000s, as I mentioned, a lot of them got back to China by the internet, and at least among intellectual circles, they were pretty well known. By now, less and less. Yes, of course, overseas people still read it, but not as much as I wish could. Okay, Susan.
This may be too personal, but when you were reading the translation of one of her poems,
Yeah.
you seemed to be very moved.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could sort of explore for us a little bit of what moved you so deeply.
I've read that poem to audiences before, and that usually happens to me.
Okay.
It's just a problem. It's a quirk in my personality. I think that that happens to me, not just with Liu Xiaobo, with other moving things. I wish it didn't. I wish I could read it without that, but I can't. Someway. I read it in Congress. Lionel mentioned this hearing that happened in July, the day that he died, and I read that, and my voice quivered, and people asked me the same question. Nancy Pelosi tapped me on the shoulder and said that was lovely.
Poetry can move in a way that prose can't.
Yeah, I suppose. But I've had that problem reading prose sometimes.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I have two things. I even met Liu Xiaobo when I was quite young in Hangzhou at the time, and it was 1992.
Can I interview you afterwards?
I think this is better, yeah. Okay.
So I remember it seemed at the time that the student democratic movement had floundered in Beijing, that Hangzhou was still possible, that there was a kind of moment of possibility.
In 1992?
In 1992 or 91, I can't believe I'm misremembering, but he was there at the Zhongguo Meiyuan, or now Hangzhou Meiyuan, or then Hangzhou Meiyuan, Zhongguo Meiyuan. And so it seemed like that there was that moment when it seemed like that the democratic movement might shift and change its locus, but then sort of somehow died again in the south and north. Anyway, my question was, do you feel like aesthetics of human freedom is a worthwhile document, should be studied? And then the second question is, what do you think might happen to her? Do you think she might take up the mantle? Or,
Well, there's three questions I heard. First, the Hangzhou in 1992. I don't remember a resurgence. 1992 all across China was a very stultifying year. Hangzhou has some of his friends though. A man named Wen Kejian was in Hangzhou, and he was one of the authors of Charter 08 Live Later. Your second question was. Yeah, you mean his PhD dissertation? Is it worth reading? I don't think it's worth reading, except as a document to understand his history. I'm working now on a short intellectual biography of him, and I'm reading things like that. But in the long run, to understand his mature ideas, I think the essays in this book are better. But to understand his development, yes, I think it's worth reading. And thirdly, will Liu Xia, his wife, take up the mantle? Absolutely not. She doesn't want to. And they're terribly in love with each other. And they have all these poems that they write back and forth to each other. But she always was a little bit irritated, is the wrong word. Wished he wouldn't be such a gadfly, wished he wouldn't go get his head chopped off because of his political writings. And there's quite a bit of evidence for that. And in her own work, you know, she's a poet and an artistic photographer. I don't know if anybody's seen her photographs. The first ones that got her famous are called the doll series, where she has these little dolls that have grotesquely misshapen expressions on their faces. And they just look miserable and almost sickly. And she has them in different poses in front of books and on the eaves of houses and so on. Those dolls are Chinese people. So she's got her underlying her political criticisms there, but not nearly as explicit as he is and doesn't want to be. Her attitude is almost more radically anti-government than his. Her attitude is, as far as I understand it, I don't even want to touch any of that. Let's write our poems and stay clear of that mess.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
And this is a bit of a lazy question. So, Professor Link, I spent a lot of time reading bad academic prose, and so you've discouraged me from reading the original Charter 8. So I was wondering.
No, it's not that bad.
I was wondering if you could comment a little more on the tenor of the changes that Liu Xiaobo wanted you to make. What were the type of changes that he wanted to make to the original document?
To be honest, I can't remember it with precision what they were. One had to do with mentioning the massacre or not, whether to use the word massacre or not. He didn't want to alienate people whom otherwise he could attract to sign it. And the Falun Gong thing involved a debate about how to view Falun Gong, which is hard for him and other modern-minded dissidents to come to grips with. Falun Gong is more a traditional kind of Chinese political phenomenon that resembles Baijiao and the Taiping Tianguo and frankly the Communist Party, how you've got this egalitarian ideology that in fact is very hierarchical and very secretive, and it ties itself to some kind of a magical book. The Falun Gong has its book, and Taiping Tianguo had its version of Christianity, Baijiao and stuff. That's the way they, and I too, see Falun Gong. So whether to involve it in a project that's doing a blueprint for a new kind of modern China was controversial.
Good enough? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming and being a part of this today. And we'll have maybe a couple minutes after people will be able to come here and say hi or something. But otherwise, thank you a lot for coming, and let's give them